Hello, everyone. It's been requested that we go over tissue types a little bit. So that's what we're going to do before we have our first exam. So there are 4 main tissue types that you need to know the difference between each of them. And they are epithelial tissue, sometimes called epithelium. There's connective tissue, which is sometimes called matrix. There's muscle tissue, and then there's also nervous tissue. Okay. And as you can see, we spent the majority of class time focusing on epithelial and connective because there are so many different types. Actually, I should have put in here. Now for each tissue type, you need to be able to tell me its structure. So what does it look like? Can you identify it from a picture? What is its function? What does it do? And then within the epithelial, connective, and muscle tissues, you also need to be able to tell me a little bit more in depth about each particular type. So I'm going to start off with functions. And I may need to do another board when we get to structure. Let me change this to pink for function. Okay, so epithelial tissue, this one you guys did pretty well with for the functions on your practice assessment. So its main function is for protection. It's what makes up your skin. That forms a protective layer from the outside, but also you have a protective epithelial layer all down your inside through your what's called your GI tract, your gastrointestinal tract. So your mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine are all lined with epithelial tissue for that protection. It's also for secretion / excretion. So for example, you have glands all throughout your body, and a gland makes some sort of substance, and then it will inject that substance to a particular place. So for example, your adrenal gland makes adrenaline and secretes it into your bloodstream to prepare your body for a flight or fight response in a stressful situation. You also have sweat glands. That's a kind of an exocrine gland that secretes sweat to the exterior of your body to help cool you down. And the sweat glands actually are involved with excretion, as a little bit of urea, which is a waste product from cell respiration, does come out of sweat, which is part of why you stink when you sweat. Another function is absorption. This can be seen in the small intestine. As an example, the small intestine is lined with a layer of simple columnar epithelial tissue, and one end of it is full of microvilli to increase surface area. And the function here is to absorption is taking in something from one side to another. And in this case, in the small intestine, it's the digested products of everything that you have eaten that need to be absorbed and get into your body. If they are not absorbed, it does your body no good. So you can kind of see this in people who have a tapeworm. They may eat everything under the sun all day long, but the tapeworm is preventing that food from being absorbed and getting into their body. So they are still thin and their body is lacking the nutrients it needs to do the job that it needs. Okay. So those are the functions, not to be confused with the actual anatomy or the special characteristics for epithelial tissue. These two traits were mixed up fairly frequently on the quizzes, and I saw that a lot of people had to go back and redo them. So I'm going to title it special characteristics. Okay, and the special characteristics is when you're describing physically what does that main epithelial tissue look like. So for the main epithelial tissue, there's different ways to call them. But first off, every single epithelial tissue has a free surface. A part of it is exposed either to the outside world, as in the case with your skin is exposed to the air, or it is exposed to a cavity inside your body, as is the case with several of the membranes, or it might be exposed to something called lumen, which is a space within an organ, like in the small intestine. Okay, so that we'll always have a free surface, and the other surface is always going to be attached to a basement membrane, which is made of connective tissues, so that this tissue is anchored in place. Another characteristic is these cells are avascular, which means they have very, very poor blood supply. In fact, epithelial tissue doesn't have its own blood supply. It rests on that basement membrane, and then the blood supply is underneath in the anchoring layer of connective tissue. So what that means is the thicker the epithelial tissue and the farther away you get from those blood vessels, the less nourished that tissue is going to be as you get away from the blood vessels, because the blood is what's carrying the oxygen and also the nutrients that those cells need to stay alive. So especially in the case of stratified squamous epithelium, those outer layers of cells are actually dead, but that's okay because they have a lot of keratin in them and they become very hard and scale-like and form extra protection for the human body. Okay. They also, because of that, because they don't have a blood supply and they do die off, they regenerate very easily. So they say you get new skin somewhere between every 7 and 14 days because the skin has to flake off once it's dead, and the new skin grows from the bottom up. And we'll actually be looking more in depth at that when we get to the next chapter on the integumentary system. But there is a layer of stem cells at the base of the skin that goes through quite fast mitosis and cell division. And the very last one is these cells are tightly packed. They actually have something called tight junctions that they form with one another, and that's to increase the protectiveness of the epithelial tissue. So basically a tight junction is when the proteins that are on the plasma membranes of two adjoining cells, those proteins will touch and sort of intertwine and form a solid lock in between the cells so that there's no free space between them. So no outside pathogens or microorganisms or chemicals or whatever can get through without actually passing through a cell. So in the small intestine, you do want your food to get through, but it has to go through that epithelial cell, the simple column there. And that way, if there is a problem, like you get a stomach bug or something, or there's a toxin in it, it will just simply kill off that particular cell and the cell will regenerate, and then the body should be okay. That's about all there is for the epithelial tissue. I'll make another video to go a little bit more in depth onto the specific types. For connective tissue, it has quite varied functions. So I'm going to start actually with the structure first. So the structure or the anatomy of connective tissue. And it is characterized by a large matrix, which is why it's called matrix sometimes. So this is space outside of the cells of this tissue. There are actually very few cells in the tissue and a lot of matrix. So those cells are important for maintaining the tissue. The cells are what actually makes the matrix, which is laid down during embryonic development, you know, when a baby is still forming, basically. But those few cells make the matrix, and the matrix is basically made of different protein fibers, of which there are collagen and elastin are the main ones. And there are also reticular fibers as well. and then something called a ground substance. But for our purposes, we're mostly going to focus on the collagen and the elastin. And those are basically proteins that they're fibrous. They look like clothing fibers or hairs just on a microscopic level. And the different connective tissues have different ratios of these fibers arranged in different ways. And then that's what lends that connective tissue into many different characteristics. So for example, all of the fibers would be arranged in parallel lines, but and then have layers that are perpendicular to one another. Those give extra stretch and extra strength and support to such tissues such as your fibrocartilage or your ligaments that hold your bones together, versus a tissue like areolar, which is really, really common throughout the body. Its fibers are widely spaced apart and they kind of go every which way. And that tissue is mainly for connecting and binding different tissue types together within the body, and also stopping up any excess fluids that are in the body. That's fairly common within the body, that you make extra fluids. Now, the functions of connective tissue are quite varied. Connective tissue, it seems like it's the leftover category, just everything that we didn't know where to put it goes here, but that's not entirely the case. Its main underlying theme, if you will, is the presence of those, that large extracellular matrix and the protein fibers that make it up. But first off, one of its functions is connection. That's why we call it that. In your book, it says it's for binding tissues together. Same thing, it just depends on how you want to call it. So for example, the basement membrane under skin connects the epithelial tissue to the adipose tissue that's in a deeper layer to the skin. Keeps the skin actually on your body so it doesn't just fall off of you. Another function is to provide support and protection. And that is most readily demonstrated in the skeletal system. Bone is very, very dense and protects your soft internal organs from physical injury. So the most well-protected organ in your entire body is your brain. It is completely surrounded by bone. And once you're no longer an infant, that bone is fused together 100%, so that your brain does not suffer any damage or injury. Another function is for serving as a framework. You can see this in reticular tissue. This can be seen in very delicate tissues like your spleen or your pancreas. The reticular fibers kind of look like the stems on a bunch of grapes, and then the cells hang off of it, similar to the grapes in this scenario. So it provides a backbone basically for these cells to stick to while they're doing whatever function they're doing. So in the case of the pancreas is making digestive enzymes and also insulin and glucagon, hormones that help regulate your blood sugar. Next, it also fills spaces in your body. That would be like the areolar tissue. And it stops up extra fluids if too many are produced, lymph fluid basically, and it'll return that fluid to the lymphatic system. You have adipose tissue that stores fat, which I know a lot of us wish we didn't have that, but we do need it. It does serve a purpose. And even if you are very slender and thin, you do still have fat deposits that are invisible from the outside. That fat is deposited around your organ, for example, your heart, to provide extra energy in case of an emergency. And that is the purpose of fat tissue, is to store energy. It wasn't always that humans had access to food readily, pretty much whenever we wanted. There were more times of plenty and times of famine. So our bodies evolved to turn any extra calories into fat. And then when times are leaner, we start burning that fat to make ATP to keep ourselves alive. These connective tissues are also what makes our blood cells. These are made in your stem cells, blood stem cells that are found within your long bones. So they make more red and also more white blood cells. And the red blood cells are very important for you staying alive because red blood cells are what carry oxygen through your body. And oxygen, along with the glucose in your blood, are what the mitochondria uses to be the powerhouse of the cell and make ATP. Connective tissue also helps to protect you against infections. And this can be seen with your immune system cells. Your lymph nodes basically are a type of connective tissue. They make your white blood cells, specifically your B cells and your memory cells that remember when you've been sick with something before, and then it hangs around, you know, kind of like a specially trained police officer to go kill and attack that pathogen later so that you don't get nearly as sick as you did the first time that you were sick with this pathogen. And last but not least, they also help with, I'm going to call it wound repair, or well, maybe I should say wound healing. And this again would be your white blood cells and other that help if, say, you have a bruise, which is called a hematoma, or a contusion, which is if you get a cut on the outside. Those need to be repaired. A bruise is actually a type of internal bleeding. If the blood is not going to the cells aren't getting the nutrients and oxygen they need, being wasted, so that needs to be repaired in a timely manner. Those are the two most difficult of these four tissues. The other ones are very straightforward because they're much more specialized. So let me go around here to nervous. So its structure, excuse me, its function, let me grab this, I'll move this one up some. Okay, so the function of nervous tissue is basically keeping you alive is the best way to say it. Oh, I'm having some lag here. There we go, function. So communication, sensation, integration. Better way than communication would be, let me change that. I'm going to put response to stimulus. So basically, you have nerves that pick up sensory stimuli. These can be things like your five senses that you're used to hearing about, like taste or smell or vision. But in reality, we actually have way more than five senses. Just in your tongue alone, you have a different type of nerve for each different specific molecule that you can taste. So it's not enough that we just taste sweet. You have a nerve that can recognize when you're tasting sucrose, one when you're tasting fructose or glucose or maltose or lactose, and it's a different sensation. All of those are sugars, but they taste sweet in a different way. We also have many, many, many other receptors. There are proprioceptors that can detect the stretch in a muscle. So if you've ever exercised and you feel that, oops, I shouldn't have done that, that's a proprioceptor telling you like, hey, you shouldn't have moved that way. And then there are chemoreceptors within your digestive tract too that can keep track of what you have eaten and what they tell your body what enzymes you need to make to digest it. Your brain and spinal cord, your central nervous system, they do the integration. So they receive all that stimuli, figure out what to do about it to keep your body in homeostasis. And then the central nervous system sends a signal back out to your glands or your muscles, your effector neurons, and tell them a response to do. So if the sensation is, I see a fist and it is flying at my face, the effect would be, maybe we should duck. Or another example, I see a lion, it is chasing me. So the effect would be, maybe I should run, okay? In those situations, the gland, the adrenal gland, is told to release adrenaline, which sends more blood and more oxygen to your leg muscles so you can run away. And it also triggers your body to start breathing more so you have oxygen to get the energy to your leg muscles so you can run away. And then the brain will also trigger those muscles to start firing. As far as structure goes, for this chapter, we're only going to focus on the neurons. So just neurons. There are other cells in the nervous system that do make up nervous tissue. We'll focus more on those when we get to that chapter. So neurons, they are long, thin, delicate structures. They have a cell body called the soma, and then they have long, long axons that reach all throughout the body, and then also dendrites that help the cell communicate. So the cells connect to one another like wires that are kind of daisy chained together, and the dendrite of the neuron picks up on a stimulus, sends it down through the axon to the next neuron, and so on and so forth. If you're looking at these in pictures, they're going to look like little stars with long tails on them, basically. Now with muscle tissue, its function, this one's easy, just one function, is for movement. Okay, sweet and short. Now it depends upon which type it is as to what is being moved. So if it is a smooth muscle, these are muscles that are found in all of your hollow organs, like your stomach. This is what makes your stomach gurgle or churn, or your blood vessels, or your bladder. Underneath the epithelial tissue, you have smooth muscles. And those help to move whatever is inside those organs in a direction. The skeletal muscle system is the one we're going to focus on more when we get to the muscular system. That's for movement of your whole body. They can be small. It can be something as simple as the little muscles in your eyes that you use to look up and down with, or they can be quite large, like your quadriceps or your hamstrings and your thigh. Those are your larger muscles. The last category is cardiac muscle, and the cardiac muscles move blood. Basically, your heart is a glorified pump, and it expands and contracts and squeezes the blood through it in a certain fashion to get it to the lungs to pick up oxygen and offload carbon dioxide. And then that blood goes back to the heart and gets pumped again to go throughout the body to deliver the oxygen and nutrients to the tissues where it needs to be. Now its structure, it has three. It just depends on, come on. All right, so there are three structures here. So for let's do skeletal first. Skeletal has long, very long cylindrical, which means it's like a cylinder, cylindrical cells that are also multi-nucleus. They have more than one nucleus. And this is because in utero, during fetal development, those multi-nucleate cells were actually originally many different cells that fuse together, and you need the multiple nuclei to be able to coordinate the cells since they are so long. You have probably your longest skeletal muscle cells run from your rear end basically down to the back of your knee. That's how long they are. They're tiny. You wouldn't be able to see it with your eye if we pulled one out with you. Smaller by far than even a hair, but it is there. The next one, let's go with smooth muscle. These are uninucleate. We only have one uninucleate in the cell, and they're short cells and tapered, and so we call them spindle shaped. Like if you've ever seen Snow White, no, not Snow White, sorry, Sleeping Beauty, she pricked her finger on a spindle. The end of the spindle is similar to the shape of a smooth muscle cell. Okay, and then the cardiac muscle cells, let's go with R. These cells are branching uninucleate cells. Oh, and they're also striated. They have stripes. That is something too that the skeletal muscle cells also have, striated. That has to do with the way the fibers within the cell are structured. I need to move these around a little bit. There we go. So within the skeletal and the cardiac muscle cell, they do have their own special fibers called actin and myosin, and they're arranged in different ways in those cells, but we will learn more about those later. For now, the only fibers you need to worry about are the ones in connective tissue. So those are the four main tissues. So if you're asked a question about what do they do, here you go. You have all the structures and all the functions. And then I will upload a video of all of the specific types of tissues within each of these four categories separately. I'll probably do nervous and muscle together though, just because they're short and sweet.